architect, great speaker, very smart man, a very honest and straight man, and in politics, that's a bit of a rarity and bad experience. So, ladies and gentlemen, Michael Leahy. Thank you.
That's good. Thank you very much for coming out here today, and I hope I can raise some important points for your attention. What always happens when a system of politics is undergoing radical change is that the power elite will do almost anything to hold on to power, including the introduction of repressive legislation. And I believe we're at such a moment now. We are facing in the proposed hate speech bill, which is before the Dáil in the present session, is a fundamental and sweeping attack against our democracy. I also fear that it may be only the first in a part of a system of legalised repression, and for that reason we, the ordinary people of Ireland, must do everything we can to stop it. From antiquity, freedom of speech has been recognised as essential to any system which calls itself democratic. Free speech has moreover been recognised as the primary freedom, because without free speech no other freedom can be defended. So much so that in ancient Greece, the Athenian lawmaker Solon, one of the fathers of that democracy, made it a crime for citizens to refuse to engage in controversies. This legislation may do the reverse and make it a crime for people to actively engage in certain political controversies. No society can call itself democratic unless its people have a free opportunity to express their opinions, and that is why we must stop this government from enacting this legislation. Masquerading under the guise of preventing hate speech, which is a sinister Orwellian term that has no place in a free society and which remains undefined, this legislation intends to make it a criminal offence punishable by up to 5 years imprisonment to engage in prejudicial acts or acts which are described as hateful. We already have legislation on the statute books and have had for over 30 years which prohibit incitement to hatred. The proposed legislation is being brought in at the behest of radical, highly articulate, heavily funded government pressure groups because they make the ridiculous claim that there are insufficient prosecutions under the present legislation. The fact that there are so few prosecutions does not mean that the legislation isn't working. It means that the legislation is working and that we don't have a problem of hate in this country. Certainly not from the ordinary people who will be targeted by this legislation. The Irish people are a tolerant people. We are not given to hate, despite what RTE tells us, and despite what the army of NGOs say. And we are not given to racial oppression. This legislation is being brought in to make jobs for the army of busybodies and malignant do-gooders whose role is to go about the place, annoying ordinary decent people and preventing them from getting on with their lives. Pandering to the gender extremists, the race baiters, and the Antifa mob, the government are facilitating the most violent, the most intolerant, the most narcissistic, and the most regressive elements in our society. That is where this legislation has come from. And if that is the kind of person that this government panders to, then I think maybe it is time that the rest of us started making the government listen to our voices and reminded them that we are here as well, and we're not going to let them trample on our liberties and our rights. This proposal will turn the law on its head. The most destructive part of this legislation is that for the first time, it allows the courts to take into account the perception of an allegedly injured party or even a third-party witness in determining whether an offence has taken place. This will mean that there will be no objective definition of hate or prejudice, but that if a person takes offence and states that they have taken offence, this may be taken by the courts as proof of prejudice under the Act. By this means, the burden of proof is being shifted from the prosecution proving your guilt to the defendant being required to prove their innocence. This is very, very dangerous stuff. This is a complete rejection of objective law. It turns the legal architecture on its head, and it places every one of us in danger from the hate mobs and the fascist organizations which use sexual, ethnic, and religious politics as a means of attacking and undermining society and of criminalizing those with whom they disagree. Every one of us is threatened by this legislation, and we must stop it, or we will have no country left worth fighting for. We all know perfectly well that there are large numbers of state-sponsored bodies and state-paid individuals whose sole purpose in life is that of taking offence, and if not offended, to find something which they could theoretically be offended by. At most of our meetings, you get a few of them to show up. I'm glad there's not too many of them here today. Maybe it's a sunny day. I've said that no freedom can be defended without free speech. I would go further and say that no government and no democracy can call itself legitimate if it rejects free speech, for in doing so it rejects its own primary function of providing good government. No such government can justly call on the obedience of its people, and in fact, it is a moral duty of every citizen to oppose by any peaceful means any government which attacks its liberty, because the rejection of free debate will have a stabilizing effect on society and will exact a terrible cost on our nation and on our people. How impartially do you think this legislation will be enacted? We all know it will not be enacted in an impartial manner. Its primary targets will not be the gender extremists of the Antifa mobs who disrupt peaceful assembly, the hate mongers of Radio Television and the Irish Times, or the propagandists who promote religious intolerance against Christians and against the native Irish people. It will be used against anyone who questions the communist narrative, which is now the stock in trade of all of our Marxist parties, from Fine Gael right through to Sinn Féin. This legislation has a political motivation, and only a political motivation. Do you really think that the extensive surveillance powers of the state, with its absurd obsession with the mythical far right, or whoever they are, will ever be used against the various gender movements because of the hatred they promote against men and against young boys, or even against TERFs? I don't think so. Like so much of recent government action, the purpose of this legislation is to do the direct opposite of what it claims. Instead of preventing hatred, its purpose will be to exacerbate hatred against anybody whom the present woke culture despises, and to foster division within our society. Its purpose is to criminalize the innocent and to facilitate the criminal, and to turn law and justice on its head. Where do the courts stand in our present situation? Do we really think that our higher courts, which sat on their hands for 2 years and did nothing while our liberties were filleted by a reprehensible government acting without scientific justification during the lockdown, do we really think they will be capable of protecting our interests and our liberties? Our present judiciary are mostly Fine Gael appointees. Is it not right to ask whether political appointees with the rise and higher preferment will ever really function as champions of the liberties of the people? The evidence today seems to be that they will not. In that case, I say it's time we swept the present legal system away from our courts and adopted an independent judiciary whose sole function and duty is the protection of the rights and liberties of the people against government overreach and potential tyranny. And if that means amending our constitution, that I say for once, perhaps that's an amendment that I would support. We must ask, why now? Why is this? Why are these attacks against freedom and liberty being made now? At such a time of international, political and economic crisis, a time of alarming inflation, the destructive impact of a war in which we should have no involvement. Maybe it's precisely because of those crises that this repressive and coercive legislation is being introduced. I want to suggest a number of specific reasons that the government would want to attack free speech at this time. The first is COVID. And that, by the way, is a cause which is making many people wake up. We often think we're hopeless, that we're not being listened to. But I see more and more people who watched through the COVID scam and know there is something very, very seriously wrong with the way we run this country, and very, very seriously wrong with what's happening. People are waking up. They mightn't be here in numbers yet, but they are listening to us. The government knows that it has a serious, guilty, and terrible secret, and it will do everything it can to cover that up. We all remember during the lockdown the repeated calls to prevent people telling the truth, and Dr. Carroll was one of them, about the medicines that were available, the calls to have people imprisoned who questioned the hysteria and panic deliberately promoted by the state and the European Union, and the efforts made to destroy the careers of conscientious doctors who tried to save their patients' lives. Evidence is rapidly emerging of excess deaths, the ineffectiveness of the vaccines, the enormous economic, social and health damage caused by the lockdowns, and the government will do everything it can to prevent an open investigation of the potentially criminal actions in which it and so many state institutions were engaged. We saw what they did to us during lockdown, the wreckage of our economy, the fact that we were advised to protect Granny by getting those damnable shots, And now we're being advised that the best thing to do with Granny is to freeze her to death to save the planet and to stand by Ukraine. Are these people crazy? Are we now to be accused of hate speech for demanding justice against those who have done so much harm to our society? We urgently need a proper investigation into COVID, and if we don't get it, they will do it again. The second reason is climate. I have no doubt that the COVID lockdown was a dry run for a massive state repression, surveillance, and brutalisation of our society, including theft of property and seizure of our possessions, which will be justified by the crackpot ideology of climate change. The cult, exactly. How often have we heard in the past that climate deniers should face imprisonment? Are we not now setting the foundations in this legislation for just such an attack against proper political and scientific debate? An attack against free speech is not just an attack against democratic politics, it is an attack against science as well. One of the protected characteristics of the proposed legislation is that of religion. It's very clear to me that the climate ideology has become a cult, a religious belief system which is beyond reason and which, like the Inquisition of old, seeks to destroy those who question it. Thirdly, the waning power of the European Union. Every decision made by the European Union in connection with the present war has damaged the interests of the European peoples, has ensured the destruction of our industry, has guaranteed that the elderly will be forced into poverty and hypothermia this winter, and has exacerbated a housing crisis by providing an effectively open-ended immigration into this country, which is unsustainable and which, if not stopped, will lead to social unrest. They don't want people talking about that. And if you question what they're doing in regard to Ukrainian immigration, you will immediately be described as a racist and run the risk of being held guilty of a criminal offence under this current legislation which is proposed. When a political system is an obvious failure, as in the European Union, it will do anything. It will enact any repression. It will break any law. It will commit any crime in order to hold on to its power. And remember, the people who have brought Europe to the energy and economic crisis we now face will never face an electorate. Ursula von der Leyen, the madwoman of Brussels, may merely go about wrecking the lives of the people and demanding cuts in energy in countries where heat is necessary to stay alive, but she will never have to face the electorate for the crazy politics that she enforces upon us. Such people, such tyrants will enact any coercion to maintain their power and position, and that is where this legislation is coming from. Fourthly, the rapid promotion by all elements of our government and our state actors of a gender ideology which will brook no interference, will brook no debate, and will rapidly turn to violence against anyone who questions their dogmatic beliefs. Trans and sexual identity are specifically protected in this legislation, and that protection bodes ill for anyone who does not fully comply with the irrational hate-mongering of the groups who promote their beliefs. We need to vote these people out. The problem with condemning our government is that the main opposition party, Sinn Féin, are worse in almost every respect you can think of. No party has less right to wave the Irish tricolour. No party has less right to describe itself as nationalist. And no party is more committed to the enslavement of the Irish people to globalist elites than is Sinn Féin. It seems to me that all of the parties in our Dáil are deliberately engaged in a process of destroying our economy on the basis of climate nonsense, of destroying our liberty on the basis of trans and gender nonsense, and of destroying our sovereignty and independence as a nation on the basis of following the European Union down the disastrous path it has taken in the present European war. We must wake up to the fact that the great bulk of our elected representatives, captured as they are by the European Union, by the World Economic Forum, that horrible, sinister body, and by the radical and intolerant groups which they promote, have genuinely become the enemies of the people and the enemies of the Irish nation. All of this is not a pretty picture, but I do think people are waking up. Maybe our numbers aren't great here today, but I know I talk to so many people who realize there is something rotten in this state and it needs to be swept away. Ireland must go, as it has always done, to learn from its history that the dark night of tyranny does not endure, and that those who fight for liberty will achieve it. The Irish Freedom Party is a small one, but we will fight to provide you with a genuine alternative to the repression that you face. While we still can, I appeal to all of you to make your feelings known and to make it clear that you will not, under any circumstances, vote for any TD who supports this legislation. This must be the hill on which we die, because if they take this one, it will become more and more difficult to fight against tyranny and repression into the future. Time is short. Time is really short. Once again, I ask all of you to stand up for our free nation on this, its 100th anniversary year, to stand up for liberty and to stand by the rights and freedoms of the Irish people. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Brian,
Thank you very much.
great speech. Well, we've got some very talented people in Ireland, haven't we? I think